The Moon and Sixpence, the famous novel by Somerset Maugham. Part 1, Chapter 1. I confess that when first I made acquaintance with Charles Strickland, I never for a moment discerned that there was in him anything out of the ordinary. Yet now few will be found to deny his greatness. I do not speak of that greatness which is achieved by the fortunate politician or the successful soldier. That is a quality which belongs to the place he occupies rather than to the man, and a change of circumstances reduces it to very discreet proportions. The Prime Minister out of office is seen too often to have been but a pompous rhetorician, and the general without an army is but the tame hero of a market town. The greatness of Charles Strickland was authentic. It may be that you do not like his art, but at all events you can hardly refuse it the tribute of your interest. He disturbs and arrests. The time has passed when he was an object of ridicule, and it is no longer a mark of eccentricity to defend or of perversity to extol him. His faults are accepted as the necessary complement to his merits. It is still possible to discuss his place in art, and the adulation of his admirers is perhaps no less capricious than the disparagement of his detractors. But one thing can never be doubtful, and that is that he had genius. To my mind, the most interesting thing in art is the personality of the artist, and if that is singular, I am willing to excuse 1,000 faults. I suppose Velasquez was a better painter than El Greco, but custom stales one's admiration for him. The Cretan, sensual and tragic, proffers the mystery of his soul like a standing sacrifice. The artist, painter, poet, or musician, by his decoration, sublime or beautiful, satisfies the aesthetic sense, but that is akin to the sexual instinct and shares its barbarity. He lays before you also the greater gift of himself. To pursue his secret has something of the fascination of a detective story. It is a riddle which shares with the universe the merit of having no answer. The most insignificant of Strickland's work suggests a personality which is strange, tormented, and complex, and it is this surely which prevents even those who do not like his pictures from being indifferent to them. It is this which has excited so curious an interest in his life and character. It was not till 4 years after Strickland's death that Maurice Huret wrote that article in the Mercure de France, which rescued the unknown painter from oblivion and blazed the trail which succeeding writers, with more or less docility, have followed. For a long time, no critic has enjoyed in France a more incontestable authority, and it was impossible not to be impressed by the claims he made. They seemed extravagant, but later judgments have confirmed his estimate, and the reputation of Charles Strickland is now firmly established on the lines which he laid down. The rise of this reputation is one of the most romantic incidents in the history of art. But I do not propose to deal with Charles Strickland's work except in so far as it touches upon his character. I cannot agree with the painters who claim superciliously that the layman can understand nothing of painting, and that he can best show his appreciation of their works by silence and a checkbook. It is a grotesque misapprehension which sees in art no more than a craft comprehensible perfectly only to the craftsman. Art is a manifestation of emotion, and emotion speaks a language that all may understand. But I will allow that the critic, who has not a practical knowledge of technique, is seldom able to say anything on the subject of real value, and my ignorance of painting is extreme. Fortunately, there is no need for me to risk the adventure, since my friend, Mr. Edward Leggett, an able writer as well as an admirable painter, has exhaustively discussed Charles Strickland's work in a little book, which is a charming example of a style, for the most part less happily cultivated in England than in France. Maurice Huret, in his famous article, gave an outline of Charles Strickland's life, which was well calculated to whet the appetites of the inquiring. With his disinterested passion for art, he had a real desire to call the attention of the wise to a talent which was in the highest degree original. But he was too good a journalist to be unaware that the human interest would enable him more easily to effect his purpose. And when such as had come in contact with Strickland in the past, writers who had known him in London, painters who had met him in the cafes of Montmartre, discovered to their amazement that where they had seen but an unsuccessful artist, like another authentic genius had rubbed shoulders with them, there began to appear in the magazines of France and America a succession of articles, the reminiscences of one, the appreciation of another, which added to Strickland's notoriety and fed without satisfying the curiosity of the public. The subject was grateful, and the industrious Weitbrecht Rotholz, in his imposing monograph, has been able to give a remarkable list of authorities. The faculty for myth is innate in the human race. It seizes with avidity upon any incidents, surprising or mysterious, in the career of those who have at all distinguished themselves from their fellows, and invents a legend to which it then attaches a fanatical belief. It is the protest of romance against the commonplace of life. The incidents of the legend become the hero's surest passport to immortality. The ironic philosopher reflects with a smile that Sir Walter Raleigh is more safely enshrined in the memory of mankind because he set his cloak for the Virgin Queen to walk on than because he carried the English name to undiscovered countries. Charles Strickland lived obscurely. He made enemies rather than friends. It is not strange, then, that those who wrote of him should have eked out their scanty recollections with a lively fancy, and it is evident that there was enough in the little that was known of him to give opportunity to the romantic scribe. There was much in his life which was strange and terrible, in his character something outrageous, and in his fate not a little that was pathetic. In due course, a legend arose of such circumstantiality that the wise historian would hesitate to attack it. But a wise historian is precisely what the Reverend Robert Strickland is not. He wrote his biography avowedly to remove certain misconceptions which had gained currency in regard to the later part of his father's life and which had caused considerable pain to persons still living. It is obvious that there was much in the commonly received account of Strickland's life to embarrass a respectable family. I have read this work with a good deal of amusement, and upon this I congratulate myself, since it is colourless and dull. Mr. Strickland has drawn the portrait of an excellent husband and father, a man of kindly temper, industrious habits, and moral disposition. The modern clergyman has acquired, in his study of the science which I believe is called exegesis, an astonishing facility for explaining things away, but the subtlety with which the Reverend Robert Strickland has interpreted all the facts in his father's life, which a dutiful son might find it inconvenient to remember, must surely lead him in the fullness of time to the highest dignities of the Church. I see already his muscular calves encased in the gaiters episcopal. It was a hazardous, though maybe a gallant thing to do, since it is probable that the legend commonly received has had no small share in the growth of Strickland's reputation. For there are many who have been attracted to his art by the detestation in which they held his character, or the compassion with which they regarded his death, and the son's well-meaning efforts threw a singular chill upon the father's admirers. It is due to no accident that when one of his most important works, The Woman of Samaria, was sold at Christie's shortly after the discussion which followed the publication of Mr. Strickland's biography, it fetched £235 less than it had done 9 months before, when it was bought by the distinguished collector, whose sudden death had brought it once more under the hammer. Perhaps Charles Strickland's power and originality would scarcely have sufficed to turn the scale if the remarkable mythopoeic faculty of mankind had not brushed aside with impatience a story which disappointed all its craving for the extraordinary. And presently Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz produced the work which finally set at rest the misgivings of all lovers of art. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz belongs to that school of historians, which believes that human nature is not only about as bad as it can be, but a great deal worse. And certainly the reader is safer of entertainment in their hands than in those of the writers who take a malicious pleasure in representing the great figures of romance as patterns of the domestic virtues. For my part, I should be sorry to think that there was nothing between Anthony and Cleopatra but an economic situation, and it will require a great deal more evidence than is ever likely to be available, thank God, to persuade me that Tiberius was as blameless a monarch as King George V. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz has dealt in such terms with the Reverend Robert Strickland's innocent biography that it is difficult to avoid feeling a certain sympathy for the unlucky parson. His decent reticence is branded as hypocrisy, his circumlocutions are roundly called lies, and his silence is vilified as treachery. And on the strength of peccadilloes, reprehensible in an author, but excusable in a son, the Anglo-Saxon race is accused of prudishness, humbug, pretentiousness, deceit, cunning, and bad cooking. Personally, I think it was rash of Mr. Strickland in refuting the account which had gained belief of a certain unpleasantness between his father and mother, to state that Charles Strickland, in a letter written from Paris, had described her as an excellent woman, since Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz was able to print the letter in facsimile, and it appears that the passage referred to ran in fact as follows: "God damn my wife. She is an excellent woman. I wish she was in hell." It is not thus that the Church in its great days dealt with evidence that was unwelcome. Dr. Weitbrecht Rotholz was an enthusiastic admirer of Charles Strickland, and there was no danger that he would whitewash him. He had an unerring eye for the despicable motive in actions that had all the appearance of innocence. He was a psychopathologist as well as a student of art, and the subconscious had few secrets from him. No mystic ever saw deeper meaning in common things. The mystic sees the ineffable, and the psychopathologist the unspeakable. There is a singular fascination in watching the eagerness with which the learned author ferrets out every circumstance which may throw discredit on his hero. His heart warms to him when he can bring forward some example of cruelty or meanness, and he exults like an inquisitor at the auto da fe of an heretic when with some forgotten story he can confound the filial piety of the Reverend Robert Strickland. His industry has been amazing. Nothing has been too small to escape him, and you may be sure that if Charles Strickland left a laundry bill unpaid, it will be given you in extenso, and if he forbore to return a borrowed half-crown, no detail of the transaction will be omitted. Chapter 2. When so much has been written about Charles Strickland, it may seem unnecessary that I should write more. A painter's monument is his work. It is true I knew him more intimately than most. I met him first before ever he became a painter, and I saw him not infrequently during the difficult years he spent in Paris, but I do not suppose I should ever have set down my recollections if the hazards of the war had not taken me to Tahiti. There, as is notorious, he spent the last years of his life, and there I came across persons who were familiar with him. I find myself in a position to throw light on just that part of his tragic career which has remained most obscure. If they who believe in Strickland's greatness are right, the personal narratives of such as knew him in the flesh can hardly be superfluous. What would we not give for the reminiscences of someone who had been as intimately acquainted with El Greco as I was with Strickland? But I seek refuge in no such excuses. I forget who it was that recommended men for their soul's good to do each day 2 things they disliked. It was a wise man, and it is a precept that I have followed scrupulously. For every day I have got up and I have gone to bed. But there is in my nature a strain of asceticism, and I have subjected my flesh each week to a more severe mortification. I have never failed to read the literary supplement of the Times. It is a salutary discipline to consider the vast number of books that are written, the fair hopes with which their authors see them published, and the fate which awaits them. What chance is there that any book will make its way among that multitude? And the successful books are but the successes of a season. Heaven knows what pains the author has been at, what bitter experiences he has endured, and what heartache suffered, to give some chance reader a few hours' relaxation or to while away the tedium of a journey. And if I may judge from the reviews, many of these books are well and carefully written. Much thought has gone to their composition. To some even has been given the anxious labor of a lifetime. The moral I draw is that the writer should seek his reward in the pleasure of his work and in release from the burden of his thought, and indifferent to aught else, care nothing for praise or censure, failure or success. Now the war has come, bringing with it a new attitude. Youth has turned to gods we of an earlier day knew not, and it is possible to see already the direction in which those who come after us will move. The younger generation, conscious of strength and tumultuous, have done with knocking at the door. They have burst in and seated themselves in our seats. The air is noisy with their shouts. Of their elders some, by imitating the antics of youth, strive to persuade themselves that their day is not yet over. They shout with the lustiest, but the war cry sounds hollow in their mouth. They are like poor wantons, attempting with pencil, paint and powder, with shrill gaiety, to recover the illusion of their spring. The wiser go their way with a decent grace. In their chastened smile is an indulgent mockery. They remember that they too trod down a sated generation, with just such clamour and with just such scorn, and they foresee that these brave torch-bearers will presently yield their place also. There is no last word. The new evangel was old when Nineveh reared her greatness to the sky. These gallant words, which seem so novel to those that speak them, were said in accents scarcely changed 100 times before. The pendulum swings backwards and forwards. The circle is ever travelled anew. Sometimes a man survives a considerable time from an era in which he had his place into one which is strange to him, and then the curious are offered one of the most singular spectacles in the human comedy. Who now, for example, thinks of George Crabbe? He was a famous poet in his day, and the world recognized his genius with a unanimity which the greater complexity of modern life has rendered infrequent. He had learnt his craft at the school of Alexander Pope, and he wrote moral stories in rhymed couplets. Then came the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and the poets sang new songs. Mr. Crabbe continued to write moral stories in rhymed couplets. I think he must have read the verse of these young men who were making so great a stir in the world, and I fancy he found it poor stuff. Of course, much of it was. But the odes of Keats and of Wordsworth, a poem or two by Coleridge, a few more by Shelley, discovered vast realms of the spirit that none had explored before. Mr. Crabbe was as dead as mutton, but Mr. Crabbe continued to write moral stories in rhymed couplets. I have read desultorily the writings of the younger generation. It may be that among them a more fervid Keats, a more ethereal Shelley, has already published numbers the world will willingly remember. I cannot tell. I admire their polish. Their youth is already so accomplished that it seems absurd to speak of promise. I marvel at the felicity of their style. But with all their copiousness, their vocabulary suggests that they fingered Roget's thesaurus in their cradles. They say nothing to me. To my mind, they know too much and feel too obviously. I cannot stomach the heartiness with which they slap me on the back, or the emotion with which they hurl themselves on my bosom. Their passion seems to me a little anæmic, and their dreams a trifle dull. I do not like them. I'm on the shelf. I will continue to write moral stories in rhymed couplets, but I should be thrice a fool if I did it for aught but my own entertainment. Chapter 3. But all this is by the way. I was very young when I wrote my first book. By a lucky chance, it excited attention, and various persons sought my acquaintance. It is not without melancholy that I wander among my recollections of the world of letters in London, when first, bashful but eager, I was introduced to it. It is long since I frequented it, and if the novels that describe its present singularities are accurate, much in it is now changed. The venue is different. Chelsea and Bloomsbury have taken the place of Hampstead, Notting Hill Gate, and High Street, Kensington. Then it was a distinction to be under 40, but now to be more than 25 is absurd. I think in those days we were a little shy of our emotions, and the fear of ridicule tempered the more obvious forms of pretentiousness. I do not believe that there was in that genteel Bohemia an intensive culture of chastity, but I do not remember so crude a promiscuity as seems to be practiced in the present day. We did not think it hypocritical to draw over our vagaries the curtain of a decent silence. The spade was not invariably called a bloody shovel. Woman had not yet altogether come into her own. I lived near Victoria Station, and I recall long excursions by bus to the hospitable houses of the literary. In my timidity, I wandered up and down the street while I screwed up my courage to ring the bell, and then, sick with apprehension, was ushered into an airless room full of people. I was introduced to this celebrated person after that one, and the kind words they said about my book made me excessively uncomfortable. I felt they expected me to say clever things, and I never could think of any till after the party was over. I tried to conceal my embarrassment by handing round cups of tea and rather ill-cut bread and butter. I wanted no one to take notice of me, so that I could observe these famous creatures at my ease and listen to the clever things they said. I have a recollection of large, unbending women with great noses and rapacious eyes, who wore their clothes as though they were armor, and of little, mouse-like spinsters with soft voices and a shrewd glance. I never ceased to be fascinated by their persistence in eating buttered toast with their gloves on, and I observed with admiration the unconcern with which they wiped their fingers on their chair when they thought no one was looking. It must have been bad for the furniture, but I suppose the hostess took her revenge on the furniture of her friends when, in turn, she visited them. Some of them were dressed fashionably, and they said they couldn't for the life of them see why you should be dowdy just because you had written a novel. If you had a neat figure, you might as well make the most of it, and a smart shoe on a small foot had never prevented an editor from taking your stuff. But others thought this frivolous, and they wore art fabrics and barbaric jewelry. The men were seldom eccentric in appearance. They tried to look as little like authors as possible. They wished to be taken for men of the world, and could have passed anywhere for the managing clerks of a city firm. They always seemed a little tired. I had never known writers before, and I found them very strange, but I do not think they ever seemed to me quite real. And I remember that I thought their conversation brilliant, and I used to listen with astonishment to the stinging humor with which they would tear a brother author to pieces the moment that his back was turned. The artist has this advantage over the rest of the world, that his friends offer not only their appearance and their character to his satire, but also their work. I despaired of ever expressing myself with such aptness or with such fluency. In those days, conversation was still cultivated as an art. A neat repartee was more highly valued than the crackling of thorns under a pot, and the epigram, not yet a mechanical appliance by which the dull may achieve a semblance of wit, gave sprightliness to the small talk of the urbane. It is sad that I can remember nothing of all this scintillation. But I think the conversation never settled down so comfortably as when it turned to the details of the trade, which was the other side of the art we practiced. When we had done discussing the merits of the latest book, it was natural to wonder how many copies had been sold, what advance the author had received, and how much he was likely to make out of it. Then we would speak of this publisher and of that, comparing the generosity of one with the meanness of another. We would argue whether it was better to go to one who gave handsome royalties or to another who pushed a book for all it was worth. Some advertised badly and some well, some were modern and some were old-fashioned. Then we would talk of agents and the offers they had obtained for us, of editors and the sort of contributions they welcomed, how much they paid 1,000, and whether they paid promptly or otherwise. To me, it was all very romantic. It gave me an intimate sense of being a member of some mystic brotherhood. Chapter 4. No one was kinder to me at that time than Rose Waterford. She combined a masculine intelligence with a feminine perversity, and the novels she wrote were original and disconcerting. It was at her house one day that I met Charles Strickland's wife. Miss Waterford was giving a tea party, and her small room was more than usually full. Everyone seemed to be talking, and I, sitting in silence, felt awkward, but I was too shy to break into any of the groups that seemed absorbed in their own affairs. Miss Waterford was a good hostess, and seeing my embarrassment, came up to me. "I want you to talk to Mrs. Strickland," she said. "She's raving about your book." "What does she do?" I asked. I was conscious of my ignorance, and if Mrs. Strickland was a well-known writer, I thought it as well to ascertain the fact before I spoke to her. Rose Waterford cast down her eyes demurely to give greater effect to her reply. "She gives luncheon parties. You've only got to roar a little and she'll ask you." Rose Waterford was a cynic. She looked upon life as an opportunity for writing novels and the public as her raw material. Now and then she invited members of it to her house if they showed an appreciation of her talent and entertained with proper lavishness. She held their weakness for lions in good-humored contempt, but played to them her part of the distinguished woman of letters with decorum. I was led up to Mrs. Strickland, and for 10 minutes we talked together. I noticed nothing about her except that she had a pleasant voice. She had a flat in Westminster overlooking the unfinished cathedral, and because we lived in the same neighbourhood, we felt friendly disposed to one another. The Army and Navy Stores are a bond of union between all who dwell between the river and St. James's Park. Mrs. Strickland asked me for my address, and a few days later I received an invitation to luncheon. My engagements were few, and I was glad to accept. When I arrived a little late, because in my fear of being too early I had walked 3 times round the cathedral, I found the party already complete. Miss Waterford was there, and Mrs. J., Richard Twining, and George Road. We were all writers. It was a fine day, early in spring, and we were in a good humour. We talked about 100 things. Miss Waterford, torn between the aestheticism of her early youth, when she used to go to parties in sage green, holding a daffodil, and the flippancy of her maturer years, which tended to high heels and Paris frocks, wore a new hat. It put her in high spirits. I had never heard her more malicious about our common friends. Mrs. J., aware that impropriety is the soul of wit, made observations in tones hardly above a whisper that might well have tinged the snowy tablecloth with a rosy hue. Richard Twining bubbled over with quaint absurdities, and George Road, conscious that he need not exhibit a brilliancy which was almost a byword, opened his mouth only to put food into it. Mrs. Strickland did not talk much, but she had a pleasant gift for keeping the conversation general, and when there was a pause, she threw in just the right remark to set it going once more. She was a woman of 37, rather tall and plump, without being fat. She was not pretty, but her face was pleasing, chiefly perhaps on account of her kind brown eyes. Her skin was rather sallow. Her dark hair was elaborately dressed. She was the only woman of the 3 whose face was free of makeup, and by contrast with the others, she seemed simple and unaffected. The dining-room was in the good taste of the period. It was very severe. There was a high dado of white wood and a green paper on which were etchings by Whistler in neat black frames. The green curtains with their peacock design hung in straight lines, and the green carpet, in the pattern of which pale rabbits frolicked among leafy trees, suggested the influence of William Morris. There was blue delft on the chimney-piece. At that time, there must have been 500 dining rooms in London, decorated in exactly the same manner. It was chaste, artistic, and dull. When we left, I walked away with Miss Waterford, and the fine day and her new hat persuaded us to saunter through the park. "That was a very nice party," I said. "Did you think the food was good? I told her that if she wanted writers, she must feed them well." "Admirable advice," I answered. "But why does she want them?" Miss Waterford shrugged her shoulders. "She finds them amusing. She wants to be in the movement. I fancy she's rather simple, poor dear, and she thinks we're all wonderful. After all, it pleases her to ask us to luncheon, and it doesn't hurt us. I like her for it." Looking back, I think that Mrs. Strickland was the most harmless of all the lion hunters that pursue their quarry from the rarefied heights of Hampstead to the nethermost studios of Cheyne Walk. She had led a very quiet youth in the country, and the books that came down from Mudie's library brought with them not only their own romance, but the romance of London. She had a real passion for reading, rare in her kind, who for the most part are more interested in the author than in his book, in the painter than in his pictures, and she invented a world of the imagination in which she lived with a freedom she never acquired in the world of every day. When she came to know writers, it was like adventuring upon a stage, which till then she had known only from the other side of the footlights. She saw them dramatically and really seemed herself to live a larger life, because she entertained them and visited them in their fastnesses. She accepted the rules with which they played the game of life as valid for them, but never for a moment thought of regulating her own conduct in accordance with them. Their moral eccentricities, like their oddities of dress, their wild theories and paradoxes, were an entertainment which amused her, but had not the slightest influence on her convictions. "Is there a Mr. Strickland?" I asked. "Oh, yes. He's something in the city. I believe he's a stockbroker. He's very dull." "Are they good friends?" "They adore one another. You'll meet him if you dine there. But she doesn't often have people to dinner. He's very quiet. He's not in the least interested in literature or the arts." "Why do nice women marry dull men?" "Because intelligent men won't marry nice women." I could not think of any retort to this, so I asked if Mrs. Strickland had children. "Yes, she has a boy and a girl. They're both at school." The subject was exhausted, and we began to talk of other things. Chapter 5. During the summer, I met Mrs. Strickland not infrequently. I went now and then to pleasant little luncheons at her flat and to rather more formidable tea parties. We took a fancy to one another. I was very young, and perhaps she liked the idea of guiding my virgin steps on the hard road of letters, while for me it was pleasant to have someone I could go to with my small troubles, certain of an attentive ear and reasonable counsel. Mrs. Strickland had the gift of sympathy. It is a charming faculty, but one often abused by those who are conscious of its possession, for there is something ghoulish in the avidity with which they will pounce upon the misfortune of their friends so that they may exercise their dexterity. It gushes forth like an oil well, and the sympathetic pour out their sympathy with an abandon that is sometimes embarrassing to their victims. There are bosoms on which so many tears have been shed that I cannot bedew them with mine. Mrs. Strickland used her advantage with tact. You felt that you obliged her by accepting her sympathy. When, in the enthusiasm of my youth, I remarked on this to Rose Waterford, she said, "Milk is very nice, especially with a drop of brandy in it, but the domestic cow is only too glad to be rid of it. A swollen udder is very uncomfortable." Rose Waterford had a blistering tongue. No one could say such bitter things. On the other hand, no one could do more charming ones. There was another thing I liked in Mrs. Strickland. She managed her surroundings with elegance. Her flat was always neat and cheerful, gay with flowers, and the chintzes in the drawing-room, notwithstanding their severe design, were bright and pretty. The meals in the artistic little dining-room were pleasant. The table looked nice, the two maids were trim and comely. The food was well cooked. It was impossible not to see that Mrs. Strickland was an excellent housekeeper, and you felt sure that she was an admirable mother. There were photographs in the drawing-room of her son and daughter. The son, his name was Robert, was a boy of 16 at rugby, and you saw him in flannels and a cricket cap, and again in a tailcoat and a stand-up collar. He had his mother's candid brow and fine, reflective eyes. He looked clean, healthy, and normal. "I don't know that he's very clever," she said one day when I was looking at the photograph, "but I know he's good. He has a charming character." The daughter was 14. Her hair, thick and dark like her mother's, fell over her shoulders in fine profusion, and she had the same kindly expression and sedate, untroubled eyes. "They're both of them the image of you," I said. "Yes, I think they are more like me than their father." "Why have you never let me meet him?" I asked. "Would you like to?" She smiled. Her smile was really very sweet, and she blushed a little. It was singular that a woman of that age should flush so readily. Perhaps her naivete was her greatest charm. "You know, he's not at all literary," she said. "He's a perfect Philistine." She said this not disparagingly, but affectionately rather, as though, by acknowledging the worst about him, she wished to protect him from the aspersions of her friends. "He's on the stock exchange, and he's a typical broker. I think he'd bore you to death." "Does he bore you?" I asked. "You see, I happen to be his wife. I'm very fond of him." She smiled to cover her shyness, and I fancied she had a fear that I would make the sort of jibe that such a confession could hardly have failed to elicit from Rose Waterford. She hesitated a little. Her eyes grew tender. "He doesn't pretend to be a genius. He doesn't even make much money on the stock exchange, but he's awfully good and kind. I think I should like him very much. I'll ask you to dine with us quietly some time. But mind, you come at your own risk. Don't blame me if you have a very dull evening." Chapter 6. But when at last I met Charles Strickland, it was under circumstances which allowed me to do no more than just make his acquaintance. One morning, Mrs. Strickland sent me round a note to say that she was giving a dinner party that evening and one of her guests had failed her. She asked me to stop the gap. She wrote, "It's only decent to warn you that you will be bored to extinction. It was a thoroughly dull party from the beginning, but if you will come, I shall be uncommonly grateful, and you and I can have a little chat by ourselves." It was only neighbourly to accept. When Mrs. Strickland introduced me to her husband, he gave me a rather indifferent hand to shake. Turning to him gaily, she attempted a small jest. I asked him to show him that I really had a husband. I think he was beginning to doubt it. Strickland gave the polite little laugh with which people acknowledge a facetiousness in which they see nothing funny, but did not speak. New arrivals claimed my host's attention, and I was left to myself. When at last we were all assembled, waiting for dinner to be announced, I reflected, while I chatted with the woman I had been asked to take in, that civilized man practices a strange ingenuity in wasting on tedious exercises the brief span of his life. It was the kind of party which makes you wonder why the hostess has troubled to bid her guests, and why the guests have troubled to come. There were 10 people. They met with indifference and would part with relief. It was, of course, a purely social function. The Stricklands owed dinners to a number of persons whom they took no interest in, and so had asked them. These persons had accepted. Why? to avoid the tedium of dining tete-a-tete, to give their servants a rest, because there was no reason to refuse, because they were owed a dinner. The dining room was inconveniently crowded. There was a KC and his wife, a government official and his wife, Mrs. Strickland's sister and her husband, Colonel MacAndrew, and the wife of a Member of Parliament. It was because the Member of Parliament found that he could not leave the house that I had been invited. The respectability of the party was portentous. The women were too nice to be well-dressed and too sure of their position to be amusing. The men were solid. There was about all of them an air of well-satisfied prosperity. Everyone talked a little louder than natural in an instinctive desire to make the party go, and there was a great deal of noise in the room. But there was no general conversation. Each one talked to his neighbour on the right, during the soup, fish, and entree, to his neighbour on the left, during the roast, sweet and savoury. They talked of the political situation and of golf, of their children and the latest play, of the pictures at the Royal Academy, of the weather and their plans for the holidays. There was never a pause, and the noise grew louder. Mrs. Strickland might congratulate herself that her party was a success. Her husband played his part with decorum. Perhaps he did not talk very much, and I fancied there was towards the end a look of fatigue in the faces of the women on either side of him. They were finding him heavy. Once or twice Mrs. Strickland's eyes rested on him somewhat anxiously. At last she rose and shepherded the ladies out of one room. Strickland shut the door behind her and, moving to the other end of the table, took his place between the KC and the government official. He passed round the port again and handed us cigars. The KC remarked on the excellence of the wine, and Strickland told us where he got it. We began to chat about vintages and tobacco. The KC told us of a case he was engaged in, and the Colonel talked about polo. I had nothing to say, and so sat silent, trying politely to show interest in the conversation, and because I thought no one was in the least concerned with me, examined Strickland at my ease. He was bigger than I expected. I do not know why I had imagined him slender and of insignificant appearance. In point of fact, he was broad and heavy, with large hands and feet, and he wore his evening clothes clumsily. He gave you somewhat the idea of a coachman dressed up for the occasion. He was a man of 40, not good-looking, and yet not ugly, for his features were rather good, but they were all a little larger than life-size, and the effect was ungainly. He was clean-shaven, and his large face looked uncomfortably naked. His hair was reddish, cut very short, and his eyes were small, blue or grey. He looked commonplace. I no longer wondered that Mrs. Strickland felt a certain embarrassment about him. He was scarcely a credit to a woman who wanted to make herself a position in the world of art and letters. It was obvious that he had no social gifts, but these a man can do without. He had no eccentricity even to take him out of the common run. He was just a good, dull, honest, plain man. One would admire his excellent qualities, but avoid his company. He was null. He was probably a worthy member of society, a good husband and father, an honest broker. But there was no reason to waste one's time over him. Chapter 7. The season was drawing to its dusty end, and everyone I knew was arranging to go away. Mrs. Strickland was taking her family to the coast of Norfolk so that the children might have the sea and her husband golf. We said goodbye to one another and arranged to meet in the autumn. But on my last day in town, coming out of the stores, I met her with her son and daughter. Like myself, she had been making her final purchases before leaving London, and we were both hot and tired. I proposed that we should all go and eat ices in the park. And I think Mrs. Strickland was glad to show me her children, and she accepted my invitation with alacrity. They were even more attractive than their photographs had suggested, and she was right to be proud of them. I was young enough for them not to feel shy, and they chattered merrily about one thing and another. They were extraordinarily nice, healthy young children. It was very agreeable under the trees. When in an hour they crowded into a cab to go home, I strolled idly to my club. I was perhaps a little lonely, and it was with a touch of envy that I thought of the pleasant family life of which I had had a glimpse. They seemed devoted to one another. They had little private jokes of their own, which, unintelligible to the outsider, amused them enormously. Perhaps Charles Strickland was dull, judged by a standard that demanded above all things verbal scintillation. But his intelligence was adequate to his surroundings, and that is a passport, not only to reasonable success, but still more to happiness. Mrs. Strickland was a charming woman, and she loved him. I pictured their lives, troubled by no untoward adventure, honest, decent, and by reason of those two upstanding, pleasant children, so obviously destined to carry on the normal traditions of their race and station, not without significance. They would grow old insensibly. They would see their son and daughter come to years of reason, marry in due course, the one a pretty girl, future mother of healthy children, the other a handsome, manly fellow, obviously a soldier, and at last, prosperous in their dignified retirement, beloved by their descendants, after a happy, not unuseful life, in the fullness of their age, they would sink into the grave. That must be the story of innumerable couples, and the pattern of life it offers has a homely grace. It reminds you of a placid rivulet meandering smoothly through green pastures and shaded by pleasant trees, till at last it falls into the vasty sea. But the sea is so calm, so silent, so indifferent that you are troubled suddenly by a vague uneasiness. Perhaps it is only by a kink in my nature, strong in me even in those days, that I felt in such an existence, the share of the great majority, something amiss. I recognized its social values, I saw its ordered happiness, but a fever in my blood asked for a wilder course. There seemed to me something alarming in such easy delights. In my heart was a desire to live more dangerously. I was not unprepared for jagged rocks and treacherous shoals if I could only have change, and the excitement of the unforeseen. Chapter 8. On reading over what I have written of the Stricklands, I am conscious that they must seem shadowy. I have been able to invest them with none of those characteristics which make the persons of a book exist with a real life of their own. And wondering if the fault is mine, I rack my brains to remember idiosyncrasies which might lend them vividness. I feel that by dwelling on some trick of speech or some queer habit, I should be able to give them a significance peculiar to themselves. As they stand, they are like the figures in an old tapestry. They do not separate themselves from the background, and at a distance seem to lose their pattern, so that you have little but a pleasing piece of color. My only excuse is that the impression they made on me was no other. There was just that shadowiness about them which you find in people whose lives are part of the social organism, so that they exist in it and by it only. They are like cells in the body, essential, but so long as they remain healthy, engulfed in the momentous whole. The Stricklands were an average family in the middle class. A pleasant, hospitable woman with a harmless craze for the small lions of literary society. A rather dull man, doing his duty in that state of life in which a merciful providence had placed him. Two nice-looking, healthy children. Nothing could be more ordinary. I do not know that there was anything about them to excite the attention of the curious. When I reflect on all that happened later, I ask myself if I was thick-witted, not to see that there was in Charles Strickland at least something out of the common. Perhaps. I think that I have gathered in the years that intervene between then and now a fair knowledge of mankind. But even if when I first met the Stricklands I had the experience which I have now, I do not believe that I should have judged them differently. But because I have learnt that man is incalculable, I should not at this time of day be so surprised by the news that reached me when in the early autumn I returned to London. I had not been back 24 hours before I ran across Rose Waterford in Jermyn Street. "You look very gay and sprightly," I said. "What's the matter with you?" She smiled, and her eyes shone with a malice I knew already. It meant that she had heard some scandal about one of her friends, and the instinct of the literary woman was all alert. "You did meet Charles Strickland, didn't you?" Not only her face, but her whole body gave a sense of alacrity. I nodded. I wondered if the poor devil had been hammered on the stock exchange or run over by an omnibus. "Isn't it dreadful? He's run away from his wife." Miss Waterford certainly felt that she could not do her subject justice on the curb of Jermyn Street, and so, like an artist, flung the bare fact at me and declared that she knew no details. I could not do her the injustice of supposing that so trifling a circumstance would have prevented her from giving them, but she was obstinate. "I tell you I know nothing," she said, in reply to my agitated questions, and then, with an airy shrug of the shoulders, "I believe that a young person in a city tea-shop has left her situation." She flashed a smile at me, and protesting an engagement with her dentist, jauntily walked on. I was more interested than distressed. In those days, my experience of life at first hand was small, and it excited me to come upon an incident among people I knew of the same sort as I had read in books. I confess that time has now accustomed me to incidents of this character among my acquaintance, but I was a little shocked. Strickland was certainly 40, and I thought it disgusting that a man of his age should concern himself with affairs of the heart. With the superciliousness of extreme youth, I put 35 as the utmost limit at which a man might fall in love without making a fool of himself. And this news was slightly disconcerting to me personally, because I had written from the country to Mrs. Strickland announcing my return, and had added that unless I heard from her to the contrary, I would come on a certain day to drink a dish of tea with her. This was the very day, and I had received no word from Mrs. Strickland. Did she want to see me, or did she not? It was likely enough that in the agitation of the moment my note had escaped her memory. Perhaps I should be wiser not to go. On the other hand, she might wish to keep the affair quiet, and it might be highly indiscreet on my part to give any sign that this strange news had reached me. I was torn between the fear of hurting a nice woman's feelings and the fear of being in the way. I felt she must be suffering, and I did not want to see a pain which I could not help. But in my heart was a desire that I felt a little ashamed of, to see how she was taking it. I did not know what to do. Finally, it occurred to me that I would call as though nothing had happened and send a message in by the maid asking Mrs. Strickland if it was convenient for her to see me. This would give her the opportunity to send me away. But I was overwhelmed with embarrassment when I said to the maid the phrase I had prepared, and while I waited for the answer in a dark passage, I had to call up all my strength of mind not to bolt. The maid came back. Her manner suggested to my excited fancy a complete knowledge of the domestic calamity. "Will you come this way, sir?" she said. I followed her into the drawing-room. The blinds were partly drawn to darken the room, and Mrs. Strickland was sitting with her back to the light. Her brother-in-law, Colonel MacAndrew, stood in front of the fireplace, warming his back at an unlit fire. To myself, my entrance seemed excessively awkward. I imagined that my arrival had taken them by surprise, and Mrs. Strickland had let me come in only because she had forgotten to put me off. I fancied that the Colonel resented the interruption. "I wasn't quite sure if you expected me," I said, trying to seem unconcerned. "Of course I did. Anne will bring the tea in a minute." Even in the darkened room, I could not help seeing that Mrs. Strickland's face was all swollen with tears. Her skin, never very good, was earthy. "You remember my brother-in-law, don't you? You met at dinner, just before the holidays." We shook hands. I felt so shy that I could think of nothing to say, But Mrs. Strickland came to my rescue. She asked me what I had been doing with myself during the summer, and with this help, I managed to make some conversation till tea was brought in. The Colonel asked for a whiskey and soda. "You'd better have one too, Amy," he said. "No, I prefer tea." This was the first suggestion that anything untoward had happened. I took no notice and did my best to engage Mrs. Strickland in talk. The Colonel, still standing in front of the fireplace, uttered no word. I wondered how soon I could decently take my leave, and I asked myself why on earth Mrs. Strickland had allowed me to come. There were no flowers, and various knick-knacks, put away during the summer, had not been replaced. There was something cheerless and stiff about the room which had always seemed so friendly. It gave you an odd feeling, as though someone were lying dead on the other side of the wall. I finished tea. "Will you have a cigarette?" asked Mrs. Strickland. She looked about for the box, but it was not to be seen. "I'm afraid there are none." Suddenly, she burst into tears and hurried from the room. I was startled. I suppose now that the lack of cigarettes, brought as a rule by her husband, forced him back upon her recollection, and the new feeling that the small comforts she was used to were missing gave her a sudden pang. She realized that the old life was gone and done with. It was impossible to keep up our social pretenses any longer. "I dare say you'd like me to go," I said to the Colonel, getting up. "I suppose you've heard that blackguard has deserted her," he cried explosively. I hesitated. "You know how people gossip," I answered. "I was vaguely told that something was wrong. He's bolted. He's gone off to Paris with a woman. He's left Amy without a penny." "I'm awfully sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. The Colonel gulped down his whiskey. He was a tall, lean man of 50, with a drooping moustache and grey hair. He had pale blue eyes and a weak mouth. I remembered from my previous meeting with him that he had a foolish face, and was proud of the fact that for the 10 years before he left the army, he had played polo 3 days a week. "I don't suppose Mrs. Strickland wants to be bothered with me just now," I said. "Will you tell her how sorry I am? If there's anything I can do, I shall be delighted to do it." He took no notice of me. "I don't know what's to become of her. And then there are the children. Are they going to live on air? 17 years. What about 17 years? They've been married," he snapped. "I never liked him. Of course he was my brother-in-law, and I made the best of it. Did you think him a gentleman? She ought never to have married him. Is it absolutely final? There's only one thing for her to do, and that's to divorce him. That's what I was telling her when you came in. Fire in with your petition, my dear Amy," I said. "You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to the children." He'd better not let me catch sight of him. I'd thrash him within an inch of his life. I could not help thinking that Colonel MacAndrew might have some difficulty in doing this, since Strickland had struck me as a hefty fellow, but I did not say anything. It is always distressing when outraged morality does not possess the strength of arm to administer direct chastisement on the sinner. I was making up my mind to another attempt at going when Mrs. Strickland came back. She had dried her eyes and powdered her nose. "I'm sorry I broke down," she said. "I'm glad you didn't go away." She sat down. I did not at all know what to say. I felt a certain shyness at referring to matters which were no concern of mine. I did not then know the besetting sin of woman, the passion to discuss her private affairs with anyone who is willing to listen. Mrs. Strickland seemed to make an effort over herself. "Are people talking about it?" she asked. I was taken aback by her assumption that I knew all about her domestic misfortune. "I've only just come back. The only person I've seen is Rose Waterford." Mrs. Strickland clasped her hands. "Tell me exactly what she said." And when I hesitated, she insisted. "I particularly want to know." "You know the way people talk. She's not very reliable, is she? She said your husband had left you." Is that all? I did not choose to repeat Rose Waterford's parting reference to a girl from a tea shop. I lied. Dad, she didn't say anything about his going with anyone? No. That's all I wanted to know. I was a little puzzled, but at all events, I understood that I might now take my leave. When I shook hands with Mrs. Strickland, I told her that if I could be of any use to her, I should be very glad. She smiled wanly. Thank you so much. I don't know that anybody can do anything for me. Too shy to express my sympathy, I turned to say goodbye to the Colonel. He did not take my hand. I'm just coming. If you're walking up Victoria Street, I'll come along with you. All right, I said. Come on.